Welcome to the Demography Today lecture series, co-organized by the LOMPOP Horizon 2020 project and the VVVA Foundation. And we thank the Foundation for the support and sponsorship of this lecture series. And we have today the great pleasure to have with us Rebecca Sear. She is a professor and currently the head of the Department of Population Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She holds degrees in zoology, biological anthropology and statistics, and taught demography and anthropology at the London School of Economics and Durham University, before taking up her post in 2012 at the London School. Grantee of the European Research Council, she co-founded the European Human Behavior and Evolution Society, and she is as well honorary secretary of the British Society of Population Studies. So thank you very much for being here and in our lecture series. As usual, we have a long lecture between 45 to 1 hour lecture, and then we open the floor for questions. So welcome again, and thanks for coming.
So if you Google family, this is what you see. Pretty universal nuclear family comes up in the Google image search. There's a little bit of diversity there. There's the odd grandparent in there. But basically, Google thinks that a family is the nuclear family, mum, dad, and preferably 2 kids. This idea that the nuclear family is the traditional, the normative human family is very widespread. It's widespread in popular culture, but it's also widespread in academia and social policy as well. My background is in evolutionary anthropology, and in the mid to late 20th century, the idea that the traditional human family was the nuclear family was very much part of evolutionary anthropology. Evolutionary anthropologists assumed that our ancestors, in fact, not just human, modern human species, but ancestral species as well took this family form. You have this Australopithecine reconstruction here, which were ancestors of the human species, which is clearly in a nuclear family form with the guy having a rather patronizing hand on the shoulder of his presumably wife. So this view that the nuclear family was the traditional human family form was very widespread in evolutionary anthropology throughout most of the 20th century, still prevalent today in many social sciences and social policy. I know we have historical demographers perhaps listening. In some disciplines, like historical demography, there is a more nuanced understanding of the family. But it's certainly the case in some social sciences and social policy that the nuclear family is considered to be the normative and traditional human family. But this model really largely appears to reflect middle-class norms of the mid-20th century, when many of these disciplines, academic disciplines, were really flourishing, including evolutionary anthropology. There are 2 features of this model of the human family which are particularly problematic, as illustrated by this picture here. First is a relatively extreme sexual division of labour. As you can see in the picture, the father is clearly the one going out to work, the one providing for the family. The mother is the one staying at home, caring for the children, and being responsible for domestic labour. So often this traditional nuclear family is assumed to be a male breadwinner, female homemaker model of the human family. The second problem with this family is illustrated in this picture is that the nuclear family is assumed to be atomized. That is, that it's not getting any help from anyone outside of that family, either economically or in terms of childcare and rearing children. And this talk is going to hopefully show some evidence that these 2 features of what is considered to be the traditional human family are really quite problematic. And I'm going to do that by taking a data-driven approach to the human family. So it'll give me an opportunity to show my favourite character from Star Trek, Data. What I mean by this is that rather than simply assuming what the traditional family norm is, I want to go out and look for data from all different kinds of human societies to try and understand what that data on the family tells us about the traditional or normative human family. So I'm going to take a comparative approach to the human family. By comparative, I mean firstly comparing across species, As Diego said, my first degree was in zoology, and I still take a comparative perspective on the human species. So what insights do we get about the human family if we look at closely related ape and monkey species? But I also mean comparative in terms of a cross-cultural perspective on the human family. Our species is remarkably diverse. One of the defining characteristics of our species is that we can live in many different kinds of environments, many different kinds of subsistence strategies, many different kinds of marriage, inheritance structures, and so on. So it's really important to use data from many different kinds of society to understand what the human family actually is. In anthropology, in 21st century anthropology, evolutionary anthropology, there has been a lot of criticism recently about how much of the social sciences is based on weird people. I don't know if you're familiar with this acronym, but Joe Henrich here on the screen and his colleagues wrote a paper a few years ago about, in this case, psychology, arguing that the vast amount of psychological research that's done in academia is based on weird people, where weird is an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And they argue that this was really very problematic for a number of reasons, and it's also not just psychology that is so heavily based on weird populations. If we really want to understand the human family, we need to use data not just from weird populations, but from all different kinds of society worldwide. And that's what I mean in the subtitle by a global perspective on family and their influence on demographic outcomes. So I'm going to be jumping around the globe in the rest of this talk using examples from quite different kinds of society to try and understand what the human family actually is. First, I'm going to quite briefly talk about the problematic assumption that the traditional human family involves the male breadwinner, female homemaker model. If we look outside of weird societies, then we in fact see that male and female contributions to the diet in terms of productive labour are really quite substantial across lots of different societies. This is data from foraging or hunter-gatherer societies put together by Barry Hewlett. These figures are the contributions to the diet from males and from females. I have a writer pointer. You can see that there are a handful of populations at the bottom where males are contributing most of the family diet, but there are also populations where females are contributing most of the family diet. On average, there's something like a 50-50 split. Both males and females are contributing about half of the calories for the family's diet in foraging or hunter-gatherer societies. You get a similar picture if you look at other subsistence strategies, not just hunter-gatherer societies. Again, this is data put together by Barry Hewlett across horticultural, agricultural, hunter-gatherer, different kinds of subsistence societies. And again, you get the same picture. Again, we have the female contribution to the family diet, and there are a small number of societies, 4 in this particular table, where women are not contributing very much to the family diet. But there are an equal number of societies where men are not contributing very much to the family diet. On average, again, it looks like there's going to be something like a 50-50 split. In other words, if you look outside weird populations, then both men and women are contributing very substantial amounts of productive labour. They are both contributing to feeding children. Just before I leave this subject, I also want to make the point that what's considered to be domestic labour can also sometimes be, in fact, productive labour. The foods that we eat often require a lot of processing. So here you have a woman who's cooking maize, a foodstuff that isn't very edible unless it's prepared and cooked in a particular way. And this domestic labour is often done by women. So even if you simply divide, or even in societies where women are mainly responsible for domestic labour, this is probably underestimating the amount that women are contributing in terms of productive labour, because some domestic labour is food processing and should really be counted as productive. Okay, so that's the first problematic assumption out of the way, the male breadwinner, female homemaker model. What I want to spend most of the talk on is discussing the second assumption about the atomization of the nuclear family. And I want to provide some evidence to provide you with the punchline already that these atomized nuclear families who don't receive any help from extended family members are not normative if you look worldwide. So this is Sarah Hrdy on the screen here. I'm using a theoretical framework that she has promoted very heavily. She's an evolutionary anthropologist and primatologist who argues that humans are cooperative breeders. This is a breeding strategy that's not that common across animal species. About 10% of bird species do it, fewer mammals do it. But it's a breeding strategy where females get help from other members of their group in order to raise children. Mothers are not raising children all by themselves. And I would really recommend that you read this book by Sarah Hrdy, Mothers and Others, because it's a popular science book that talks through this idea that humans are cooperative breeders and the implications of this idea for the human species more generally. And it's a really good read. But what she points out is that if you compare the way human mothers organise their reproductive lives to those of ape and monkey species, what we do looks quite different. If you look at the closely related apes, chimpanzees, orangutans, bonobos, and so on, the mothers are only ever feeding one child at a time. They'll give birth to a child, lactate for it, but once it's weaned, it's then nutritionally independent of the mother. It may still hang around with the mother, she may still have a relationship with it, but she's no longer feeding it. She will then have another infant and start to lactate for that. This is quite different to what humans do. Human mothers can have multiple dependent children simultaneously. So this gives mothers a really heavy burden of parental care. And this is partly because we have relatively short interbirth intervals compared to other great apes, but we also have these extended childhoods. So human mothers are stacking offspring. They're raising multiple dependent children simultaneously in the way that ape mothers are not. And this requires help. That help sometimes comes from the father, as in this picture, but it also comes from the extended family. This is Sarah Hrdy's argument. So it may come from grandmothers or grandfathers. We know there's a lot of sibling care that goes on in many populations worldwide. Older siblings are caring for younger siblings. And in weird societies, you may also get help that's brought in or provided by the state. So not from kin, but from other types of carers. But this is the basic idea that I've been testing throughout much of my career recently, the idea that humans need help in order to raise their children beyond just the mother, beyond really just the mother and father, but getting help from many other sources as well. But what is the evidence for that strategy in our species? I'm now going to largely talk about the work that I've been doing, some of it funded by the ERC. Before I get into my own work, though, I need to give due credit to Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues, Jim O'Connell and Nick Burton-Jones, who's on the screen there, who were very influential in evolutionary anthropology at the end of the 20th century because of the data that they presented to show that grandmothers are really hardworking and really help to provide for their grandchildren. So they worked with hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, in sub-Saharan Africa, and their data showed quite clearly that grandmothers, older women, rather than sitting back and relaxing when they no longer had dependent children of their own, were really working very hard indeed in order to produce food, and that food seemed to be going to their grandchildren. So they wrote this paper called Hardworking Hadza Grandmothers. So this was some of the first evidence that grandmothers were really quite important in the human family. I said I'm going to give you a global perspective on the human family, so I'm now going to jump to contemporary Europe, which is a very different kind of population, but to show you data from contemporary Europe that also shows that grandmothers do a lot for their grandchildren. So this chart shows the proportion of grandmothers providing any care for grandchildren across different European countries. In the UK, for example, 2/3 of grandmothers are providing care for their grandchildren. So in quite different types of society, we have evidence that grandmothers have quite important roles in the family in terms of providing care for their grandchildren. What effect does that care have on those grandchildren? Well, this is now some work that I've done. This work was some time ago now, but it shows that the presence of grandmothers, here maternal grandmothers, actually is associated with higher survival amongst their grandchildren. So this is data from the Gambia. What this chart here shows are the survival rates over the first 5 years of life of children whose maternal grandmothers were still living, which is the dark bar at the top, and maternal grandmothers who were either no longer living or who were alive but were still reproductively active. That is, they were still looking after young children of their own. And there's a clear survival advantage for children whose maternal grandmothers are living but not caring for children of their own. We also see this mirrored in nutritional status in the Gambia. So this chart shows the height of children according to whether the maternal grandmother is either dead, alive, or reproductively active. And again, you can see a clear advantage in terms of height for children whose maternal grandmothers is alive but not looking after young children of her own. Compare this with the same data for fathers and paternal grandmothers, where there doesn't seem to be any relationship at all between having a father around or having a paternal grandmother around and the child's height. Although this particular study, we only looked at associations with child survival and child's height, we know ethnographically that maternal grandmothers have quite an important role in this society. When the mother wants to wean a child, she sends the child preferably to the maternal grandmother if she's still alive, so that the child can forget the breast. And the grandmother is meant to provide these high energy foods, peanut mashes, for the grandchild around the time of weaning. So we know ethnographically that grandmothers are really important in this society, and it seems that childcare is actually being translated into better nutritional status and higher survival rates for children in this particular high mortality environment. Incidentally, excuse me, it wasn't only maternal grandmothers that had positive effects on child nutritional status and survival in the Gambia. Elder sisters had a similar effect. So children who had elder sisters around were also in better nutritional status and also had slightly higher survival. Again, you didn't see the same relationship with elder brothers. So that's just data from a single society. I've said we need to look at data from many different kinds of society to draw conclusions. So what I went on to do next with a couple of co-authors in 2 different papers, Ruth Mace and David Cole, was to review the literature on associations between the presence of different family members and child survival, and that's what this chart here is showing. Let's concentrate on just the grandmothers for the moment. The green bars here are the percentage of studies where there was a positive association between the presence of the maternal grandmother and the child's survival. So if the maternal grandmother was around, the child was more likely to survive. The yellow part shows no relationship, the blue negative relationship. So if the grandmother was around, the child was more likely to die. You can see that in almost 70% of studies, there was a positive association between the presence of the maternal grandmother and child survival. Paternal grandmothers were also reasonably positive. In about half of cases, there was a positive association between the two. Again, compare that with fathers. In only about a third of studies was there any association between the survival status of the father and the child. So again, from this review, it seems that there is evidence that the presence of grandmothers, particularly maternal grandmothers, improves child survival.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Is that okay?
Yes.
But in this household, how do you control for the presence of the mother, the survival of the mother? Because in many of the societies, the mother who's gone, the mother is gone or the father is gone, so when the grandmother takes the place, that should be a positive effect. But how do you distinguish that from in cases where the mothers are not present?
In the Gambia, we did control for whether the mother had died or not and whether the father or other relatives had died or not.
Effect of the presence of
Yeah, in the Gambia it was. In some of these studies, these are lots of different studies, so there was a lot of variation in how the models were run. And so in some cases, that would have been controlled for, in other cases it wouldn't. So what we see from this graph is that there is not a universal positive association between grandmothers and child survival, but there is quite a consistent association, particularly for maternal grandmothers. The same is true if you look at older siblings. There weren't very many studies here, but in fact 5 out of 6 studies which had looked at the presence of these, they're known as helpers at the nest in the bird literature, older siblings, there was a positive association between having older siblings and child survival. What about the effect of grandmothers on maternal health? That is another possible route by which grandmothers could improve the health of children if they also improve the health of the children's mothers. There's not very much research so far on associations between grandmothers and maternal health, but I recently did a study with Paula Shepherd looking at this in Guatemala. And we find some admittedly quite weak evidence, but there is some evidence that the presence of the woman's mother was associated with higher BMI for the mother in this particular, the presence of an adult woman's mother was associated with higher BMI of the adult woman in Guatemala. Fairly weak effect, but it was quite consistent in comparison to the association with the mother-in-law. The mother-in-law appeared to be associated quite consistently with lower maternal BMI. I can discuss that more later, but if we stick here to the beneficial effects of maternal grandmothers, of women's own mothers, there's a little bit of evidence that mothers may also improve the health of their adult daughters, which could have a positive effect on the health of their grandchildren. But it seems that from this very brief survey, there is evidence that grandmothers have direct effects on the health and survival of their grandchildren, possibly mothers, as well as these associations between the presence of grandmothers and child health or survival. We also have other evidence that grandmothers are quite important when it comes to norms and helping mothers out with nutrition during pregnancy and feeding their children. This is Judy Obel, who has written a paper in Senegal, saying that in Senegal, grandmothers are clearly quite helpful when it comes to giving mothers advice about nutrition around pregnancy and child feeding as well. Judy, incidentally, has this NGO, the Grandmother Project. She believes that grandmothers could be very important in public health to help improve the health of children worldwide. They're currently not really recognised as being this beneficial force for good for children, but she has set up this NGO which is trying to promote the use of grandmothers in public health programmes worldwide. Okay, so that's child health and child survival. I want to shift now to a different demographic outcome, women's fertility. So this is the bit of the research that has been funded by the ERC. We have spent a number of years looking at associations between different kinds of kin and women's fertility. I'm going to start with a review of the literature. So in the same way that we reviewed the literature looking at associations between the presence of kin and child survival, we've done the same thing for the presence of kin and female fertility rates. What we have found is on the screen here. Again, these bars, or in this case, the bars show the percentage of studies where there is a positive association between each of these relatives and women's fertility. A positive association meaning that in the presence of that relative, the woman's fertility is higher. And what we see is a fairly consistent, though again not universal, association between the presence of a woman's in-laws and higher fertility. With a woman's own parents, the data look a little bit different. In about half of cases, there's a positive association. In about half of cases, there's a negative association, suggesting that overall there might not be much effect at all. However, that graph looked at all kinds of different fertility outcomes. It's actually quite complicated to look at fertility because there are many different ways that you can measure it. What we've done here on this screen is to divide up that data, but according to that fertility outcome that was being analysed, either age at first birth, length of interbirth intervals, or total number of live births. The picture looks a bit different when you divide up the data by different fertility outcomes. If, for example, you look at length of birth intervals, then in about 80% of cases, there was a positive association between both the woman's mother and mother-in-law and her fertility. So when you look at that particular measure of fertility, it seems that both parents and parents-in-law may be pronatal. Something quite different is going on with age at first birth. Again, I can talk about that more later, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move over that quite quickly. So again, we have some evidence, it's not universal, but we have some evidence that there are positive associations between the presence of certain kin and women's fertility. But again, these associations, they're just associations in these studies. We don't necessarily have evidence that these are causal relationships, and we don't necessarily have evidence from these studies that they are driven by helping behaviour between kin, which is what the cooperative breeding hypothesis would predict, that women have higher fertility in the presence of their kin because they are getting support and help from those kin, and that allows them to have more children. So what we then went on to do as part of this project was to use several different data sets ourselves to look at these questions in more detail. And we looked at, well, I'm going to show you data from two particular studies, one using the Indonesian Family Life Survey and one using data from the UK, the Millennium Cohort Study. These are both data sets which have quite detailed data on helping behaviour between kin. So we can look at not just crude associations between the presence of kin and fertility, but also look at whether these associations are driven by helping behaviour. And there are lots of different types of helping behaviour that could be driving this effect. It could be the provision of resources, it could be helping women out with their subsistence work, their productive work, or it could be kin helping women out with childcare, with domestic work and so on. Okay, first of all, Kristen Snopkowski looked at the Indonesian Family Life Survey, and she ran a path model to try and determine whether the positive association between a woman's kin and fertility was driven by helping behaviour. In this case, we did have data on fertility. We also had data on whether a woman was getting help from her parents or her parents-in-law. We had data on contact frequency between a woman and her parents and parents-in-law, and also where the kin were living, how far away they were geographically. And if the cooperative breeding hypothesis is correct, then associations between having kin around or not and higher fertility must be driven by the actual provision of help. And to cut a long and complicated story short, what Kristen found is evidence for that pathway. So she did find that the relationship between whether kin were around or not was mediated through those kin contacting the woman and also giving help to the woman. And it was these things that were having the effect on higher fertility. It also seemed like there might be a little bit of evidence that simply having contact with your mother-in-law might be increasing your fertility. Perhaps because mother-in-laws also have social roles in terms of pressuring women into having more children. But that evidence here was quite weak. The strongest evidence we found was that associations between kin and fertility were mediated by the actual provision of help. And I've shown the pathway here for mothers-in-law. In fact, you saw something similar in this case for mothers, fathers, mothers-in-law, almost fathers-in-law as well, although it was very weak for fathers-in-law. So in this particular case, it wasn't just mothers-in-law that were increasing women's fertility, it was their mothers and possibly their fathers as well. Okay, that's Indonesia. Again, we're going to move to a very different context, to the UK, the contemporary UK. So Susie Schaffnert did some work on the Millennium Cohort Study, again to see whether getting help and different types of help from kin, and in this case friends as well, was associated with higher fertility in the contemporary UK. Here the picture is a bit more complicated. The first thing we found was, in fact, that receiving financial support from either parents and parents-in-law reduced fertility, which is what you see on the graph there. So the more financial help you get from parents and parents-in-law, the less likely women were to progress to a second birth in this case. But what we did find is that women who received a lot of emotional support had a higher probability of having a second birth. This emotional support didn't necessarily come from parents and parents-in-law, it might have come from friends as well, but it seemed to be emotional support rather than material support that was associated with higher fertility in this particular context. In this particular context, the UK is socioeconomically quite an unequal country, so what we did as part of this study was also to look at whether these relationships were different in different socioeconomic groups, because we know that patterns of association between kin and patterns of fertility are quite different in different socioeconomic groups. In fact, most of our results were the same across all socioeconomic groups. The one exception was the third point on this screen here. We found that childcare from families was associated with a higher probability of second birth in lower socioeconomic groups, but the opposite was true for higher socioeconomic groups. However, the higher socioeconomic position women didn't get very much childcare from their families. They tended to buy it in from private providers instead. So this opposite relationship, we don't set much store by it because it was based on quite a small sample size. However, the lower socioeconomic position women were quite likely to get childcare from their kin, and if they did, it seemed to be associated with a higher probability of second birth. So it seems like in the UK, there is some evidence that support is associated with higher fertility, but the picture is a bit more complicated. In a relatively rich context, it seems like the provision of material resources doesn't increase fertility, may even reduce fertility. And we think the reason there may be that negative association there is that getting financial support from your kin is an indicator of need. So women who were getting financial support really needed it and were therefore not in a very good position to have another child. But we did find this quite consistent finding that emotional support from family and friends was associated with higher fertility. So we interpret this as in a relatively high income context, it may be the perception of support that really matters rather than the actual provision of support. I should also note that in this particular context, receiving support was very common. So this is a high income context where we have this normative nuclear family structure, but women in fact were getting a lot of help with child rearing. What we have on the screen here is data on different types of support, for example, childcare or financial support from parents, across different socioeconomic groups, but also according to whether women were partnered in orange or unpartnered in blue. So in a normative nuclear family context, women tend to get a lot of help from partners. If they don't, we expected that they would be trying to seek support from elsewhere to compensate. And we looked for evidence, and that's exactly what we found. So if you look, for example, at financial support and childcare from parents, unpartnered women are much more likely to get it than partnered women are, particularly for the lower socioeconomic groups. The higher socioeconomic groups tended to get more paid childcare support if they were unpartnered. So as part of this study, we also looked for this substitution of support, expecting that where women were not getting help from partners, they would be substituting support in from elsewhere, which is what we found. So now I've started talking about partners, I will talk briefly about what do men do within the family. So I've started off by saying that the normative human family is not really a nuclear family, or at least it's not an atomized nuclear family. Having said it's not an atomized nuclear family where nuclear families are not getting help from anywhere else, it is the case that a very common family form is one where mother and father are at the heart of the family. So to some extent, nuclear families are relatively common worldwide, but they're not atomized, they're getting help in from elsewhere. But those nuclear families are not universal. They can be quite variable. So there are cases where men are providing a lot of support within the family. There are some societies and men within some societies where they're providing a lot less support. And I want to talk about the role of fathers within society for the next few minutes, within the family rather. So it is clear that men have adaptations for fathering. So this is some data collected again from the Gambia a few years ago, looking at testosterone levels in men who are fathers and men who are not fathers, and according to how much contact men have with their children. So in weird societies, it's quite a common finding that men who are partnered and men who are fathers have lower testosterone than men who are not partnered and who are not fathers. This is hypothesized to be to reflect an adaptive shift in testosterone levels when men become partnered and when they become fathers towards parenting effort and away from mating effort. So once a man has a partner and has children, he should be investing in that relationship and in those children rather than seeking other relationships with other women. There is much less data, as usual, outside of weird populations. So we did a study in the Gambia a few years ago looking at whether testosterone levels were different in men who were partnered or not partnered, or fathers and not fathers, in a polygynous context. So the Gambia is a very polygynous context. Most men who survive into middle and older age have more than one wife. And what we found is that even in this polygynous context, there did seem to be shifts in testosterone according to fatherhood status. We didn't see the same overall shift from between fathers and non-fathers in the Gambia. There wasn't an overall difference in testosterone between fathers and non-fathers. However, men who spent more time with their children had lower testosterone than men who spent less time with their children. That's what the graph is showing here. These are morning and afternoon testosterone levels. Testosterone has a diurnal rhythm. It's higher in the morning, lower in the evening. And men who sleep in the same room as their children have lower morning and evening testosterone levels than men who don't sleep in the same room.
So, is this controlling for ages?
Yeah, there was a very strong, actually there wasn't a very strong age effect. It was, there was a strong age effect in terms of the relationship with partnership and fatherhood. In the Gambia, we didn't find any young men who were fathers and partnered, and we didn't find any older men who were not fathers and not partnered. So it was actually quite difficult to do exactly the same study that's done in the West in the Gambia. However, we did control for all of these things, and if you look at the time that men are spending with their children, then you see differences in testosterone. So even in a very polygynous context, it looks like there is some evidence that men have this adaptive shift towards fathering behaviour after they become fathers and if they spend a lot of time with their children. So it's clear that fathers do have an important role in the family in terms of caring for children and providing for children. But these aren't universal effects. Again, if we go back to this review of all studies which had looked at the association between the presence of these different kin and child survival, in only a third of cases was there a positive association between the presence of the father and child survival. In 2/3 of cases, it didn't seem to matter at all whether the father was alive or not. That didn't have any relationship with the child's own survival status, which is quite surprising if, when we know that men do have these adaptations for fathering, and we do know that they often do have an important role within the family. But again, it is some evidence that this men's role within the family is variable. They are very often important in children's lives, but there are cases where they don't appear to be that important. Having said that, child survival data, or rather this graph, mainly reflects paternal effects on young children because when children die, they tend to be relatively young when they die. So what this is reflecting are the effects of these different kin on quite young children. If you look at paternal effects on older children, you perhaps see more evidence that men are important. Here's some data that's actually hot off the press. This paper was published today with Paula Shepherd and David Cole. Here we looked at associations between father absence or presence and the timing of puberty. So this is effects on adolescent children, paternal effects on adolescent children. What we find is that in weird populations, there are quite consistent associations between father absence in childhood and earlier menarche. Again, they're not universal, but they are quite consistent. However, if you look at non-weird populations, you see much more variation. Sometimes father absence is associated with earlier puberty, sometimes later, sometimes no relationship at all. And if you look at boys, there are fewer studies on boys because puberty is harder to study, but again, you see quite mixed effects in both weird and non-weird populations. So fathers sometimes are associated with accelerated puberty, sometimes delayed, sometimes no relationship. But this is evidence that fathers do matter for some children at some times in their lives, although again we see a lot of cross-cultural variation. I can talk more about why that cross-cultural variation might exist later on. Okay, finally, the effects of fathers on fertility. So this also is some very recent work done with a PhD student of mine, Alex Raybould. So she is looking here not at the presence of fathers in fertility, because men aren't typically necessary to have births, but she's looking at the household division of labour and whether this affects women's propensity to have children. The idea here is that if women need support to raise children, then they are more likely to have children and have higher fertility if they're getting a lot of support at home, if men are doing a lot of household labour, essentially. Particularly, this is the case in high-income populations where women are often going out to work, where they can't combine childcare with going out to work. So it does get quite difficult for women to combine raising children and productive work. What Alice has found, again, this is a review of the literature, presented a little bit differently here, but there are many studies now which have looked at the relationship between the gender division of labour and female fertility. In most cases, where there is more equitable division of labour within the household, fertility is higher. So essentially, where men are doing more housework, then fertility is higher, to summarise that quite crudely. Again, this is not universal. You don't see that relationship in all populations. I should say this is entirely in high-income populations, this particular case. But there does seem to be some reasonably consistent evidence that where there is a gender division, an equitable gender division of labour within the household, women are more likely to have kids. So that was fathers. I want to briefly, before I conclude and then start to talk about the implications, talk about some caveats to the cooperative breeding hypothesis. So the cooperative breeding hypothesis sounds quite cooperative. It sounds quite nice. Everybody's helping mothers raise children. This sounds to be, a nice cooperative relationship. This cooperative breeding strategy, however, opens up the possibility of conflict within the family. Because if your relatives are helping you raise children, there's likely to be an expectation that you will also help other relatives raise children. So cooperative breeding isn't entirely positive. It does create the possibility of conflict within the family. And it does seem to have some quite surprising consequences. This is a marmoset. They are possibly the only other cooperatively breeding primate. So marmoset females typically have twins. This also gives them a relatively heavy burden of care. Typically they are cooperative breeders. In this case, they tend to get males to do the child care rather than grandmothers. So they have a slightly different type of cooperative breeding strategy. But marmoset mothers also need a lot of help to raise their offspring. The reason marmosets are on the screen is that they appear to be the only other primate apart from humans where maternal infanticide occurs. So primate mothers don't very often kill their own offspring. It does happen in some other mammal species, but in primates it's relatively rare. Humans do it, however, occasionally. It's not a common behaviour, but it is seen in many different populations. Marmosets are about the only other primate where maternal infanticide also appears to occur. So Sarah Hrdy, who has written another book, Mother Nature, about the contingent nature of mother love, suggests that the reason that both human mothers and marmoset mothers may occasionally commit infanticide is because they need so much help to raise offspring. If it's not a good time to raise offspring, then it might be better for them to give up on the current offspring and wait for a better time when they do have more help to reproduce and raise their offspring. So this cooperative breeding strategy might have some quite surprising consequences, such as maternal infanticide. Another example of conflict within the family is that the presence of kin doesn't always increase child survival. There are a handful of cases where the presence of particular kin, here maternal grandmothers, actually seems to reduce child survival. So after I did the study in the Gambia, I used another data set from Malawi to look at associations between the presence of kin and child survival. and was rather surprised to see that in Malawi there was a negative association between the presence of maternal grandmothers and female grandchildren. Didn't see it for male grandchildren, but girls actually seemed to suffer higher mortality in the presence of maternal grandmothers. There were some similar findings in Malawi as to the Gambia, in that fathers didn't seem to make a difference, and that elder sisters appeared to be positive in that they improved child survival. But we had these opposite effects of maternal grandmothers in Malawi compared to the Gambia. What we suspect may be happening here is that this Malawian population was a matrilineal population, and it may be that there is competition within the family between women in the family, which is actually increasing the mortality of female children if there are a lot of women in that family. We also found a similar relationship between maternal aunts and higher female child mortality, which also suggested to us it might be something to do with competition within the matriline in this matrilineal population. This particular population, it's an agricultural population, but the land is quite saturated, so they're quite resource stressed. So it may be that under certain circumstances, the fact that humans reproduce cooperatively can lead to these signs of conflict within the family if resources are scarce, if it's hard to allocate resources to all of the family. There are a couple of other cases as well where there are negative associations between grandmothers and grandchild survival, which again have been interpreted as this resource competition. So that's just a caveat that this cooperative breeding strategy that we have isn't entirely rosy. It sometimes has these negative consequences.
Can I ask another? But this surely depends on who else is close to the family you're studying to. That is, if there is a maternal grandmother or a paternal grandmother, are the results the same as when there is only one of them present? That is the conflict expressed only when competition is obvious and is as high as when competition is not that obvious?
Not that many studies have been able to look at whether there are interactions between, say, maternal and paternal grandmothers and child survival, because you need quite a lot of data for that. There have been some studies that have done it, and I think results are different between societies, but one quite surprising thing we found with the Indonesian data set is that women who were more likely to get help from parents also were more likely to get it from their parents-in-law. We thought there might be substitution effects, and that women who got a lot of help from parents were less likely to get it from parents-in-law. In fact, there seems to be some kind of Matthew effect, where if you're getting help from kin, you're likely to be getting it from a lot of kin. I don't think that answers your question, because not many studies have been able to look at those interactions between maternal and paternal grandmothers. But most studies have looked separately at maternal and paternal grandmothers, and you often see different associations. It's not very common that you see exactly the same association between maternal and paternal grandmothers. Okay, one last piece of evidence, again from Guatemala, which again may be highlighting that kin can be both beneficial and not beneficial for grandchildren in a society. Again, the results here were not hugely clear-cut, but what we found is that children tended to be in better nutritional status in terms of both height, I think that's weight, oh no, sorry, this is younger and older children. We did look at weight as well with similar results. Maternal grandmothers seem to be fairly consistently associated with better nutritional status in Guatemalan children, whereas paternal grandmothers seem to be fairly consistently associated with lower nutritional status in Guatemala, which again we thought might be evidence that the maternal grandmothers were cooperating with their grandchildren, helping to care for them, whereas the paternal grandmothers in this patrilineal society may be competing with grandchildren in some way. So that's all the data, my own data that I want to present. To conclude, before I talk about the implications, it seems like there is evidence for the cooperative breeding strategy in humans. It seems that the atomized nuclear family is not the traditional nuclear family, because we do see quite a lot of evidence that grandmothers and older siblings are often associated with positive child outcomes, particularly, though not always, maternal grandmothers. We also see that parents and parents-in-law are quite often associated with higher fertility for women, and in some cases at least, this is plausibly driven by helping behaviour between kin helping women. In this case, it may be parents-in-law that are more pronatal than women's own parents. And these associations may be different in different contexts, and the emotional support, the perception of support, may be really important in high-income contexts, whereas actual material support may be more important in low-income contexts. Fathers, too, do matter for some child and maternal outcomes, but this cooperation may also open up this possibility of conflict between family members. The bottom line here, though, is that all of these associations to some extent are cross-culturally variable. However, this variation is likely to be consistently patterned according to socioeconomic environment, according to factors in the environment. The next steps for this research are really to work out why certain kin matter in some circumstances. The data isn't quite yet, but hopefully it will be soon. Okay, those are the conclusions. I just want to end with a few implications. If the atomized nuclear family is not the traditional nuclear family, then what implications does this have for example, fertility decline? So there are some ideas about fertility decline, that it's associated with shifts in the family form, essentially. So Gary Becker, a very famous economist, who argued that part of the reason for fertility decline is that fertility declined as women's roles shifted from being entirely domestic to women going out to work to do productive labour. So this is a schematic of the fertility decline. In Western Europe at least, mortality started to decline during the 19th century. Fertility fell quite rapidly during the end of the 20th century to relatively low levels. Becker says this was partly due to a change in the human family away from this very extreme division of labour, male breadwinner, female homemaker. Fertility fell as women started to go out to work, and this caused a conflict. They couldn't go out to work and raise children. But let's look at the data about women going out to work during the Industrial Revolution. So this is data produced by CAMPOP, the Cambridge group, for population. They have recently produced some really nice maps that are now all online about a range of things during the second half of the 19th century. The maps I'm going to show you are data on women working in 1851 at the start of the Industrial Revolution, before fertility declined. The red here are areas where relatively high proportions of women are going out to work, married women are going out to work. The blue are relatively low proportions of married women going out to work. This is the same map in 1911, so this is after fertility had begun to drop quite substantially, well into the Industrial Revolution. According to Becker's argument, what you should have seen here is an increase in the red, in more married women going out to work. In fact, you see the exact opposite. During this period, it seems that women moved out of the workforce. So this suggests to me, well, Becker's argument I've had trouble with for some time, but this data also reinforces to me his argument doesn't really make sense when you look at human families worldwide and throughout human history. It seems that it wasn't the case that women started going out to work during the Industrial Revolution and that this reduced fertility, because I've shown you some evidence which argues that women have always worked. They've always contributed very substantially to productive labour. So the idea that the Industrial Revolution caused women to suddenly start engaging in productive labour, and this meant they had to reduce fertility, doesn't seem to hold water. Alaka Basu presented a paper at the IUSSP conference in 2017, arguing that in fact fertility declined because of a clamping down of women's autonomy rather than an expansion of women's autonomy. She effectively is suggesting that this idea of the atomized nuclear family was pretty much an invention of the Industrial Revolution, that the economic and other changes that were happening during the Industrial Revolution led to women being confined to the home, whereas previously they had engaged in a lot of productive labour. So Alaka Basu's argument suggests that Gary Becker has it exactly wrong, at least in that one aspect of the argument about fertility decline. Also on fertility decline, I think these ideas about what the traditional human family is are quite important for non-weird parts of the world where fertility is still relatively high, where there is a lot of interest from international organisations in reducing fertility. A lot of the family planning, a lot of the contraceptive marketing that goes on in these parts of the world is very often based on this idea of the atomised nuclear family. This is a family planning poster. And this is quite problematic if the atomised nuclear family is not a common family form in parts of the world where you're trying to promote family planning and reduce fertility. I think it's quite problematic to import these Western ideas to parts of the world where they don't really exist. There's some evidence that importing these ideas is having an impact and is starting to shift family forms in other parts of the world, which could be quite problematic. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But in low fertility, high income parts of the world as well, these ideas about what the traditional family form are affect the way that social policies are made around how women and couples balance work and family. And it could be the idea that atomised nuclear families with the male breadwinner, female homemaker model are quite problematic and could be causing very low fertility rates in parts of the world that have very low fertility rates. So this graph shows fertility in various high-income populations. Some of these populations do have very low fertility rates, well below 1. Pretty much all of these high-income populations are, below 2, are below replacement fertility of 2.1 children. But in some parts of the world, there are extremely low fertility rates in East Asia and Southern Europe, where fertility rates are not very much higher than 1. And it might be because these are parts of the world where it is very difficult for women to combine motherhood and going out to work, because there is an assumption that the atomised male breadwinner, female homemaker family form is the traditional family form, the one that we should be generating policy to deal with. I would argue that because throughout human history women have combined work and motherhood, because it's been relatively easy to do that throughout most of human history, women are likely to have preferences for doing just that. And where it is very hard for women to combine work and motherhood, then you're going to see very low fertility rates. And social policy needs to acknowledge that, in fact, women combining work and motherhood is the traditional family form. It's what most human mothers have done throughout all of human history. Okay, very finally, implications for health. One of the reasons I think importing Western ideas of the family to non-Western parts of the world, one of the reasons I think that's problematic is because I don't think that the atomised male breadwinner, female homemaker, nuclear family is necessarily a very healthy family for anyone. So this is a study recently published from the University of Essex in the UK, which found that working mothers were extremely stressed. Quite likely because it is very hard in many Western societies for women to combine both motherhood and working, which, again, I'd argue is what their evolved preferences really want them to do. It's also been suggested that postnatal depression, which is relatively common in the Western world, might be an artifact of women not having enough support for child rearing. It might be a novel phenomenon, in fact. And it's related to the fact that women are expected to raise children with very, very little help immediately after the birth. They're sent back home. They're typically living without other kin around. Their partner may be out at work all day. This is a very difficult situation for mothers to be in. And again, historically, it's a very unusual situation for mothers to be in. And it may be that this expectation that women are solely responsible for raising kids may be causing postnatal depression. But it may not just be mothers who suffer in this particular family form. It also puts a heavy burden on fathers. If fathers are expected to solely provide for their wife and children, their families, this puts a very heavy burden on men. Again, throughout most of human history, men and women would have cooperated to feed children with the help of other family members. So if you get a situation where men alone are expected to provide for their families, this puts a lot of risk and a lot of burden on men. Could be leading to poor male health as well. Finally, although this atomised nuclear family form tends to be seen as best for children in the West, I would also argue that this may not be the ideal family form to raise children in either. for a number of reasons. One is that siblings or children have a very different role in society within the family than they have had throughout most of human history. For one thing, they are not doing much sibling care. They're not caring for their younger siblings, which we see very commonly in other populations worldwide. If children aren't learning how to parent essentially by doing this sibling care, this could have implications for their future fertility intentions and their future parenting skills as well. In addition, Sarah Hrdy, this is a quote from Sarah Hrdy's Mothers and Others book, Sarah Hrdy argues that humans are a very cooperative species because we are cooperative breeders. However, we're also a species that relies a lot on learning to develop our skills. She argues that children throughout human history have been raised in cooperative families, and it's being raised in these cooperative families, that's how they have learned their social and cognitive skills to cooperate with others. Sarah argues that if children are raised in these atomized nuclear families where they're stuck at home with their mothers essentially all day long, they're not learning these social and cognitive skills that they need to be effective humans, essentially. And Sarah Hrdy has this rather depressing quote about how compassion in the quest for emotional connection will fade away as surely as sight in cave-dwelling fish if children are not raised in these cooperative environments. So some of the implications of this atomized nuclear family, in my view, are not very good for mother, father, or child health. I can't leave you with quite such a depressing quote, however, so I will thank all of my collaborators, many of whom I think I forgot to mention, without whom all of this work wouldn't have been possible. I will also leave you with this take-home message, just in case you've missed it so far, that this is not the traditional human family. Thank you for your attention.